Hello, and welcome to another engaging episode of Stan the History Man. And I'm your host, Dr. Stanley Sandler. Today, I want to talk about something that's very much on our minds, and that is inflation. Now, we all know what inflation is, but let's just get formal. I'll give you an official definition of it. Too much money chasing too few goods. All right. Now, inflation goes back into the ancient world, although I don't think uh, government responsibility for inflation goes much beyond the Roman Empire. Now you had coinage that was debased, uh, usually by counterfeiters. They would sweat gold coins to get the gold out of them. They would file them. They would clip them. But that's not government policy. But in the later days of the Roman Empire, to pay its bills, the Roman Empire did issue cheap money, not paper money, of course. We never got to that horror until much later. But the coins that had much less gold in them or much less silver, whatever they were, and therefore it would take more. You want to buy a jug of wine, and it used to cost 1 drachma, but that drachma isn't a real drachma anymore. It's only half of what it used to be, so you have to pay 2 drachma. But with the fall of the Roman Empire, that pretty well ends inflation. Now there was inflation in wartime or in disaster. Often, actually, with the Hebrews in the New Testament, there was a drought in the land, and then there was a famine in the land, and prices would go up. But then afterwards, they would come back down again. And in the Middle Ages, I mean, you're talking, 1,000 years of pretty much no inflation, except to say locally, with famines. And then later, war would cause inflation, which we certainly experienced the United States during the Revolution when, again, the government couldn't pay its bills, so it just issued a lot of paper money. So it had the paper money going out there, but it didn't have anything to back it up. And so the farmers especially would not honor those continental bills. In fact, they were not worth a continental was in actually for maybe the first half or third of the 19th century after the War of Independence, not worth a damn meant, or not worth a continental meant not worth a damn. So there were instances of inflation, but not consistent and not long term. During the Napoleonic Wars, there was inflation in England. France may have been the first to issue paper money. They're called assignats, like they assign this piece of paper to be worth, a pound of meat or something like that. But again, with the end of Napoleon, the conservative allies that had won the war, Britain and Austria especially, went back to hard money, gold-based, the gold and silver, but the basis was gold. And that's the way things went in the United States, except for during the Civil War. And an interesting thing happened during the Civil War that not a lot of people know about. The Civil War, Lincoln freed the slaves and so on, of course. But also, they issued the first paper money. Greenbacks, our dollar bills, come from this and was to pay for the war. And there was inflation during the Civil War. It was pretty bad. But also wages went up to some extent, so it was bearable. Okay, put it that way. And after the Civil War, they kept on with the paper money, but the greenbacks. But they now big debate whether it should be backed with gold or silver. Precious metals. I mean, don't we wish we do that today? The farmers wanted cheaper money, because they're always in need of money to get their crop, because they're only paid like once a year when the harvest comes in. In the meantime, they have to, provide all kinds of stuff, buy all kinds of stuff. So they wanted cheap money, silver, and the business interests. You say the Republicans, mostly Republicans, would be in favor of hard money. So easy money and hard money arguments, very bitter arguments. And I just wonder how people, very complicated, esoteric arguments about whether the coin at ratio of 16 to 1, 16 silver dollars to 1 gold dollar and so on. But all this time, after, say, 1873, Republican administration felt that the money was coming in now, and they could issue gold coins, magnificent gold. Have you ever seen like a gold dollar at that time or a silver dollar? They're magnificent species. You know, when you had one of those things, you had some money, which represented the United States. And this is the way there was a moderate global inflation, or at least in the developed world, late in the 19th, early 20th century, the finding of gold in Alaska and Australia, which put more money onto the market than there was gold. But nobody really was worried about inflation then. And then, of course, World War I, all countries began turning out paper money, and the United States did as well. But again, there were price controls. So you can get away with price controls in wartime. People say, okay, well, I'll accept the fact that I can't charge this much for my product, even though I may have a loss on it or won't make so much profit. I'll put up with it. But as soon as the war was over, we went back to monies backed up by gold, silver, and the full faith and credit of the U.S. government, which is what the dollar bill says to this day: legal tender for our all debts, public and private. And then came the Depression, prosperity in the 20s. A lot of people don't know this about the 20s. It struck me during I don't talk about this special. I give maybe a separate talk on it. Throughout that entire decade, 1920 to 1931, there was no war. So how can that be possible? Well, there are a couple of peace treaties that apparently were backed up by the great powers. There were only a few tribal punch-ups, which the British stopped by just bombing them. But we had a naval disarmament treaty back in the day when battleships were the way you determine a country's power. We had the Kellogg-Briand Peace Pact between Germany and France, enemies in World War I, but let's get together now. It's prosperous times. And so it's a kind of a side point to what I'm talking about now, but it is interesting, intriguing. Only 200 years in world history, most historians say altogether, have been years of peace. And the legacy of the 1920s, we think about all this, bathtub gin and Al Capone and that. No, more than that. Anyway, the Depression came, it was in 1929. That began to bite in 1931. And then just the opposite happened, depression. People were not making as much. There were not that much goods around. People weren't making it, weren't buying it. So there was less money, but more goods, just the opposite. And it's interesting, again, a lot of people know that the Depression was the Depression, but financially speaking, depression. And yet I've read writers who want to know better saying, oh, the Depression was really bad, all that unemployment and inflation. There was no inflation in the 1930s, the exact opposite. There was depression. I think at the bottom I've read, now historians, don't get exactly right, economists don't, but I mean, they pretty much agree. At the bottom of the Depression, about 1933, a dollar was worth $2.50. So what this meant is that if you had a job, let's say you were working for the post office or in the military, then you would be doing very well. I was they made out like a bandit, but you did pretty well. And people tried. My dad tried to join the Army during the Depression. They were only taking veterans that year. And another year, they just closed down the recruiting offices. I read about a guy who joined, got into the Army Air Corps, and they were paid basically the pay and the expenses and all had been determined by Congress in the 1920s. The budget for the military. But then again, everything was worth 2.5 times as much as it used to be. He said all they had was steak and eggs for breakfast. They got almost tired of it. And even then, they hadn't spent all the food money. So the mess sergeants would throw cartons of cigarettes onto their bunks to spend up that money. Because you know how it is in the government. If you don't spend it, you're going to lose it. So they didn't want to lose it. So in a sense, they were living like kings during the Depression because they had a job. And of course, a lot of Americans didn't, to be fair. So it was a period that we cannot even imagine today, with prices going down. But of course, a lot of Americans weren't thinking about prices going down. They were thinking about, well, I don't have a job. In fact, the Roosevelt administration wanted to bring back inflation, not because he was evil or anything, but he felt that if we have more money around, if we have inflation, there'll be more money around and more people will be working. So what he did was he took us off the gold standard. In fact, and I don't like this, he made Americans turn in their gold. They could only keep like gold heirlooms, or dentists could keep it for filling your teeth if you could afford to go to the dentist. But all other Americans, they were considered to be capitalist, evil, that money, that gold, and they had to. Now they got paid for it, but still they had to turn. It's illegal to own gold. I'm not sure when that law ended. I hope it was not too long afterwards, but that's another story. So throughout the Depression, the idea was to bring back inflation, and it didn't work very well. I mean, and I should point this out with the Depression. The Roosevelt administration did not lift us from the Depression. Again, I've heard people, historians, well, not historians, but radio commentators, someone who should know better, saying, oh, he lifted us from the Depression. Hey, in 1939, the unemployment rate was 9%. The only thing that, as it were, kicked us out of the Depression was the war in Europe. Then war contracts were starting to come in. My dad got a job as a sheet metal worker at the Brewster Aircraft Company, which of course is long gone. And so, in matter of fact, some of you are familiar, veterans, of the deuce and a half truck, the Jimmy deuce and a half, 6x, whatever they called it, three-wheel axle, all axles powered, and everything. Wonderful truck. I would argue maybe it's the best truck ever made, except it's only 6 miles per gallon. But then in wartime, who's counting? It was a French order. And as a matter of fact, these trucks were created and on the docks when France fell. And Roosevelt, hey, wait, hold on. The Army will need those trucks. And we did. So actually, but that's what we got out of the Depression. My dad went to work, and everybody basically went to work. You went to work, or you were drafted, or you joined up. So actual inflation as we know it today, where the government consistently prints more money than it's got to back it, starts after the war. Because after the war, all kinds of expenses. We were a major power now, and we had the expenses of a major power. And every year since the war, we've had 3 years in which we bounced our budget. 1949, which was a recession year. And I believe one of the years, Bill Clinton, you got to give him credit for that, bouncing the budget. And I had one other year, but I haven't been able to locate it yet, but in which we bounced the budget. So we always had this deficit, and we printed money to cover the deficit. And there was inflation because of that. So throughout the 1950s, they said a wonderful era, everybody was working, and wonderful cars with tail fins on them and everything. But there was moderate inflation. Although back then, if it got around 2%, that's, we better watch it. Now, I remember the college president, when I was going on as an undergraduate, saying, they had a recession. They said, well, the recession's over, and we got out of it with a bang. In other words, they had to raise tuition because there was inflation. But the constant growth of the government really made it built-in inflation. So we just accept it. As a matter of fact, I heard a news commentator talking to an economist, and the economist said, well, from the end of the Napoleonic Wars, that is the Battle of Waterloo, 1815, the Battle of New Orleans, if you will, until roughly World War I, there was no inflation. And he said, no, there was no inflation. And the commentator was like, well, are you serious? Could that be? He said, yeah, we paid our bills then. And by the way, how did the United States pay its bills in those days? I mean, with all the expenses and everything, with no income tax, can't just print the money. Tariffs. Our only source of income, no income tax, was what we charge imports coming into this country. And it was also not just for the money either. It was to protect American manufacturers because we are a young, growing country. So it would protect our own steel workers, our own railroad locomotive manufacturers, and so on. Basically against England, and then against Germany, as Germany became a new industrial power. So that was it. Can you believe that? I believe there was a tax on alcohol. Remember the famous whiskey rebellion back in the 1790s? But that was pretty, I mean, if you didn't drink, you didn't pay any taxes. In fact, the income tax did not start until 1916. And the reason it was imposed was because when the Democrats came into office, they believed in more low tariff because they're still a party of the farmers. Not all farmers, but the majority of farmers. That was kind of the Democrat vote. And the farmers wanted, as I said before, things to be cheaper because they're only paid once a year for most of them anyway. So they brought that, they passed lower tariffs, and they had to make up for that money. Now, without our tariff income, what are we going to do? So they put in an income tax. But did you know the income tax in 1916 was one page? One page. No, you don't have to go to anybody. How am I going? It's so complicated. And it only applied to people who made over $100,000, which was big money then. And so in a way, the Democrats pushed it by saying, well, look, you don't make $100,000, so don't worry about it. It's only the rich. They got lots of money. You can soak the rich. I didn't quite say that, but that was kind of the general attitude. Okay, we've got an income tax. Rich people have to pay. They ought to anyway. So, and through the 20s, they kept lowering with no inflation. There was no inflation. I said no war in the 20s. There's also no inflation. As a matter of fact, in 1926, I read the dollar was worth exactly 100 cents, 100 pennies to the dollar. And a Model T Ford you could buy, a Henry's really stripped down model, for $365. $365, a real car. This just didn't have running boards or headlights or anything, but it was a real car. And that's why Henry Ford became, our first or second billionaire. So anyway, but all this had changed after the war with chronic inflation. It just stuck with us, and up and down. And some years we were able to pay our debts, at least our budget, not our debts, but our budget. And so we had no inflation, but that was very rare. So inflation is with us now. And, a prominent American economist whose name escapes me right now said, governments can make inflation, governments can end inflation. And I'll tell you one way, and I'm going to say we adopt this method, but in Germany, they had inflation like you would not believe. It was worse than Argentina. The German government deliberately printed, this after World War I, when they were socked with very high reparations for the war, and yet they were, the war had cost them a lot of money. Now they got to add to the reparations. You started the war, you're going to have to pay for it. And so what they turned to was the printing presses. And they said that this time the people who had the best jobs in Germany were guys who were working on the printing presses. They just churned the stuff out until the peak of or the depths of peak of the inflation. They say, I kind of find to believe, but it's something like 1 billion marks to the dollar. If you had a dollar, you were really, I think some people must have gone over to Germany just to buy up a lot of stuff. I've heard that soldiers who were stationed in occupation duty in Germany were buying whole streets full of houses because their dollars went so far. But it wasn't much fun for the Germans. And as a matter of fact, it was in that bleak year that Adolf Hitler staged his comic opera coup. Well, it's not a comic, about 12 people were killed, but that was the year of Hitler's coup d'etat, his failed coup d'etat. But here's how the government started that. The Weimar Republic, after the war, after the Kaiser had abdicated, the Weimar Republic said, got this financial genius on board. His name was Horace Greeley Schott. Horace Greeley, a German, he was born in America, but he was maybe the greatest financial expert who's ever lived in modern times. What he did was he put a mortgage on everything of value in Germany: houses, factories, railroads, coal mines. I don't think mortgage on churches, but certainly everything of any value was mortgaged. And on the basis of that as collateral, they issued new bonds. And then the bonds were subscribed because investors looking for something to invest in after the war, several years after the war, were saying, well, Germany is a wealthy country if you add up all the railroads and coal mines and everything. So we'll invest in Germany, and if it ever did fail, the balance failed, well, we have the option of grabbing all that good stuff. But it didn't happen. What it did was bring back prosperity. Within something like 6 months, the German mark, this value went down, and here you have the prosperous 20s in Germany as well as in the United States. So that's a good example of where government made inflation, just printing the stuff up to pay off for reparations and paper, and then, we better stop it, and then bringing back a hard mark, a new mark. So anyway, getting back to the post-war years when you have this chronic inflation, we just don't pay our bills completely anymore, and we just put it on the tab. Really, where it's just like someone that can't pay his mortgage, so he just keeps putting his mortgage on his credit card, and it's bound to happen. One other thing about inflation that nobody has ever remarked on but me, and I only because I remember it happening. Check the coins in your pocket. If you can even have any coins anymore, who uses coins, you'll find that they are almost like plastic. What they are is a lead slug washed in silver. And what happened during the Vietnam War is that Lyndon Johnson, to pay for the war, needed silver. And so he said, let's call in all the coins that were based in silver in those days. Well, the dimes, quarters, dollars, and melted down the silver, I guess. And he actually lied to us. He and the Secretary of the Treasury said, I know it's hard to believe Lyndon Johnson lied, but there you go, that no, the two will circulate, the old silver coins and then the other new coins. And, they'll kind of comply. He does remember the Say's law, an old English economist back in the 18th century said, bad money drives out good. And that's exactly what happened. Overnight, the silver coins vanished. The coin collectors, numismaticists, the people who want the silver, whatever, snaffled them in. And where do you see some of them once in a while you run across, a 1947 quarter, but they're very rare. Okay. I don't know when the last time I've seen one, but what really annoyed me about it, and you can understand my annoyance, so you can sense my annoyance, is that to me, a coin, and maybe I'm odd this way, to me, a coin is a symbol of a country. It says United States of America, or Canada, or United Kingdom. There's Queen Elizabeth on it. But a cheap, semi-plastic, throwaway coin almost, maybe that's why you just throw them away nowadays. That might be one reason. To me, is like almost an insult to the country, the sovereignty. Now, we're not the only country. I believe all the developed countries have done this. Maybe not the Swiss. They always get the economics right. The Swiss do. But anyway, it's a wide phenomenon. But it was done in 1972, I believe, by Lyndon Johnson during the Vietnam War, and nobody even noticed it. Just it was in the news a little bit, and we'll keep the old coins. They'll be in circulation. I knew perfectly well. I'm sure the Secretary of the Treasury told him about Say's law. So even the coins in your pocket have been inflated. Okay, well, as I say, governments can start inflation, they can end it. But I'm waiting for, I don't want to get political here, but I'm just waiting for some government to say, okay, enough is enough. We're going to start squeezing the fat out of the economy and end inflation, or at least cut it down to the goal, which now, 2%. Boy, we sure love to see 2% now. Well, that's it for Stan the History Man. And thank you very much for listening. And I'll talk to you later. Bye-bye.